Now, this will hardly come as breaking news to regular viewers of the Corbett Report, but I dare say even if you are part of the normie community who's never heard of an alternative media source, you will have noticed, if you have existed on this planet for any length of time, that every time you see a story, a breaking news headline in the mainstream media touting a new scientific study that says such and such piece of nutritional advice, it is a piece of hot, steaming, wet, smelly, often contradictory nonsense.
Indulge this Valentine's Day. New research in the Journal of Nutrition found additional health benefits for dark chocolate. The flavonoids, naturally occurring plant compounds in chocolate, are an antioxidant and is now thought they may help protect against type 2 diabetes.
Today's tip is to consider enjoying a glass of red wine. Red wine, along with other alcohol, can provide health benefits by increasing your HDL, or good cholesterol, and lowering your LDL, or bad cholesterol.
Researchers at Johns Hopkins University failing to find any evidence that resveratrol, the ingredient that's found in the skin of the grapes, of red grapes, and in chocolate, is linked to long life.
A study just published in the Journal of the American Medical Association says 8 cups a day can actually lower your risk for some cancers, as well as heart and lung disease.
And is coffee good or bad for you? Well, there's been a string of studies suggesting various health benefits from drinking it. Now the results of new research by the Mayo Clinic are adding a little bit of confusion.
But we have known for years that reducing your intake of red meat may be good for your heart. Now it appears we know why. Researchers at the Cleveland Clinic released a new study just within the last 24 hours showing a new connection to red meat and potential heart risk.
Cutting back on red and processed meat brings few, if any, health benefits, according to a major evidence review that contradicts the dietary advice of leading international agencies.
The new study, just published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, comes from a group of researchers who analyzed years' worth of data, mainly studies asking whether red meat or processed meats affect the risk of cardiovascular disease or cancer. Their controversial conclusions are now being met with fierce criticism.
This study is fundamentally flawed in many, many ways. The authors picked and chose what kind of evidence they wanted to use and used some of the most irrelevant evidence while ignoring some of the most powerful evidence.
Confused yet? Good. You should be, because only an insane person could hold all of these contradictory pieces of nutritional advice and dietary guidelines in their head at any one time and make them cohere, because they do not cohere. You know what I'm talking about. This week, chocolate is good for you. Next week, it's bad for you. Red wine is good for you. Red wine is bad for you, etc., etc. And the aforementioned normies in the audience who somehow or other stumbled onto this podcast may interject to say, but James, clearly what is happening here is real science is being filtered through the mainstream media lens and packaged into quick little sound bites that make a study that has real scientific validity to it and something to say into this little packaged headline that completely skews the point or misses the point or misrepresents the point of the study. Well, not necessarily so, in fact. You can and should, anytime you hear a mainstream media headline about new study says blah, 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 it is equally as lazy as what I recently pointed out on the Propaganda Watch podcast about experts say. It's a lazy journalistic cliche. A new study says da-da-da-da, and let's just report it verbatim from the abstract, and that's the extent of our reporting on it, which of course does miss a lot of the nuance and detail. But still, even so, as Corbett Report viewers will remember from earlier this year, it is not only possible, it happens quite frequently that dishonest researchers, whether consciously manipulative researchers or ones that are just trying to find a significant result that they can report to pad their resume, will and can use all forms of statistical chicanery and other forms of chicanery in order to make certain dietary pronouncements, bold, new nutritional pieces of advice, seem to have some scientific validity when they do not. In 2015, a study from the Institute of Diet and Health with some surprising results launched a slew of clickbait articles with explosive headlines. "Chocolate accelerates weight loss," insisted one such headline. "Scientists say eating chocolate can help you lose weight," declared another. "Lose 10% more weight by eating a chocolate bar every day. No joke," promised yet another. There was just one problem. This was a joke. The head researcher of the study, Johannes Bohannon, took to IO9 in May of that year to reveal that his name was actually John Bohannon. The Institute of Diet and Health was in fact nothing more than a website, and the study showing the magical weight loss effects of chocolate consumption was bogus. The hoax was the brainchild of a German television reporter who wanted to demonstrate just how easy it is to turn bad science into the big headlines behind diet fads. Given how widely the study's surprising conclusion was publicized, from the pages of Bild, Europe's largest newspaper, to the TV sets of viewers in Texas and Australia, that demonstration was remarkably successful. But although it's tempting to write this story off as a demonstration about gullible journalists and the scientific illiteracy of the press, the hoax serves as a window into a much larger, much more troubling story. What makes the chocolate weight loss study so revealing isn't that it was completely fake. It's that in an important sense, it wasn't fake. Bohannes really did conduct a weight loss study, and the data really does support the conclusion that subjects who ate chocolate on a low-carb diet lose weight faster than those on a non-chocolate diet. In fact, the chocolate dieters even had better cholesterol readings. The trick was all in how the data was interpreted and reported. As Bohannes explained in his post-hoax confession, "Here's a dirty little science secret. If you measure a large number of things about a small number of people, you are almost guaranteed to get a statistically significant result. Our study included 18 different measurements: weight, cholesterol, sodium, blood protein levels, sleep quality, well-being, etc., from 15 people. One subject was dropped. That study design is a recipe for false positives." You see, finding a statistically significant result sounds impressive and helps scientists to get their paper published in high-impact journals. But statistical significance is in fact easy to fake. If, like Bohannes, you use a small sample size and measure for 18 different variables, it's almost impossible not to find some statistically significant result. Scientists know this, and the process of sifting through data to find statistically significant, but ultimately meaningless results, is so common that it has its own name: p-hacking or data dredging. As I hope you're aware, that is a short clip from The Crisis of Science, a podcast that I released earlier this year, and which, as with all my podcasts, is available for free download. This one at corbettreport.com/sciencecrisis. I hope you'll go there and check it out, because I think it offers a pretty powerful retort to those who would say that the science underlying these nutritional studies is solid, good science. It's just the lazy journalists in the mainstream media who misunderstand or misrepresent that science. Well, I don't dispute that there are lazy journalists in the mainstream media who misunderstand and misrepresent scientific studies. Of course there are, but that does not exonerate the scientists and the scientific studies themselves, as if A, not only do scientists not make mistakes, which of course they do, but B, that they are never manipulative, deceptive, using techniques that they know will give them a significant result when there's really none to be had, to try to detect a signal amongst the almost unimaginably vast noise of most dietary studies. I mean, it is hubris itself to believe that we can pinpoint exactly the effect of, a glass of red wine per day amongst all of the other bajillion variables that are taking place in any one individual, let alone the tens or hundreds or however many people are participating in these studies and their self-reporting of what it is they're eating. I mean, there are so many ways in which, even if every scientist was 100% on the level and doing their best to try to hone in on this particular ingredient in this particular one beverage and see what its effects are, even if they were doing their best to try to do that, it would be almost impossible. But of course, throw into that all of the other incentives that I outline in that Crisis of Science episode, and it becomes highly doubtful, shall we say, that you should live your life by the latest new study says, which I'm sure many of you have figured out by now, but it is important to underline this and to really think about the underlying point of what is happening here, how it is happening, and why it is happening. Because if you answer that question, a lot of the different threads of this tapestry begin to unravel, and you get to start to see how the sausage is made and how to avoid that sausage. What an apt analogy. I just thought up on the spot. Well, there you go. So let's take a look at a very specific example of this from the broad array of nutritional advice and guidelines and dietary pontifications that we hear on a regular basis. Let's hone in on one specific case of this, which is sugar. And now this is something that I wrote about very specifically in the International Forecaster editorial almost 2 years ago. Of course, it is available as part of the Corbett Report subscriber newsletter. Please do subscribe and support the website if you appreciate this work. But back in December of 2017, I wrote The Sugar Conspiracy, which opens thusly. An explosive new study in the PLOS Biology Journal confirms 3 things that independent health researchers have been saying for years. 1. Sugar-heavy diets are worse for your health than fat-heavy diets. 2. Researchers have known this fact for decades. And 3. The sugar industry actively covered up the research supporting this fact. The study, bearing the typically unwieldy title, Sugar Industry Sponsorship of Germ-Free Rodent Studies Linking Sucrose to Hyperlipidemia and Cancer, an historical analysis of internal documents, reads like an unlikely pairing of crime thriller and academic article. At the heart of this medical thriller lies the mysteriously named Project 259, a research study which ran from 1967 to 1971 to examine the link between sucrose consumption and coronary heart disease. From the outside, the project, headed by W.F.R. Pover at the University of Birmingham, appeared to be just another clinical study in nutritional science. It involved a feeding experiment in which lab rats were separated into 2 groups, one eating a high-sugar diet and the other eating a so-called basic PRM diet of cereal meals, soybean meals, whitefish meal, and dried yeast. But this was not the passion project of an impartial scientist trying to get to the truth. This was a study sponsored by the Sugar Research Foundation, the SRF, which, in case you couldn't tell, has organizational ties to the Sugar Association, the trade association of the U.S. sugar industry. The results of the SRF's experiment, according to an interim assessment issued in 1969, were extremely interesting. Quote, among Project 259's observations was that the urine from rats on the basic diet contained an inhibitor of beta-glucuronidase activity in a quantity greater than that from sucrose-fed animals. This is one of the first demonstrations of a biological difference between sucrose and starch-fed rats. Having been a point of scientific inquiry and debate for decades, the first experimental evidence that sugar and starch are actually metabolized differently was significant enough. But as the PLOS biology article explains, the way in which this difference manifested was even more significant. Quote, this incidental finding of Project 259 demonstrated to SRF that sucrose versus starch consumption caused different metabolic effects and suggested that sucrose, by stimulating urinary beta-glucuronidase, may have a role in the pathogenesis of bladder cancer. So, surely these results were published to much fanfare and became the touchstone for a thoroughgoing scientific inquiry into the possible sugar cancer link, right? Wrong. After supporting the project for 27 months, the Sugar Research Foundation did not approve the additional 12 weeks of funding needed to complete the study. Yes, exactly as you would have predicted, the breakthrough study demonstrating a biological difference between sucrose and starch-fed rats was shelved, and none of its results were ever published. But do you want to guess what was published? An article in the New England Journal of Medicine singling out fat and cholesterol as the dietary causes of heart disease and downplaying the risk of sugar consumption. That study, too, was sponsored by the SRF, but, surprise, surprise, the sugar industry's role in funding the article was not disclosed when it was published in 1965. It took 51 years for that little factoid to be dug up by researchers and published. As I say, the fact that the sugar industry has been actively working to cover up sugar's role in coronary heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer, and numerous other ailments will come as no surprise to my regular readers. And even the most fluoride-addled victims of the mainstream fake news will have heard something of this story by now. The New York Times, of all places, broached the subject in 2011 when it dared to ask, "Is sugar toxic?" It was obediently followed by fellow MSM lapdog 60 Minutes asking the very same question the very next year. In 2015, Time magazine upped the ante considerably. Sugar is definitely toxic, a new study says. And by last year, the jig was up, as even the Huffington Post informed us. Sugar is not only a drug, but a poison too. Okay, that's the end quote from that article. I hope you will actually read through the rest of that article. I think there's some important information contained therein, but this is not, obviously, as you can tell from the substance and flavor of that article, this is not just about sugar, although that is a prime example of what we're talking about. This is about the broader context of the scientific work that is deeming to tell us what we should and should not be putting in our bodies. That, oh, by the way, just happens to be sponsored by the industry associations associated with those products. I wonder if there's a conflict of interest there. Yes, and we can prove that. It has been demonstrated in recent years that that was exactly the case when it came to sugar, which the researchers found out decades ago is actually metabolized differently than starch, and that is related to cancer, but they kind of swept that under the rug for decades and decades, and it is finally starting to come to light, which in and of itself is a rebuke to those who would say that, oh yes, there may be a bad researcher here or there, a bad apple that is working from non-pure scientific motives, but that will be routed out. Yeah, maybe it will be routed out. After half a century, generations have grown up under this false dietary regime, and we visibly see the result of that with the waistline of not only the average American, but people around the world ballooning in that intervening time. Do you think there's a connection? Yeah, maybe there is. And it is one of those facts that is difficult, I would hope, for the average person out there to even wrap their head around, that people would participate in a cover-up like this, that they can visibly see is harming entire generations of people.